Hello, we're here for the non-dual lectionary for Good Friday on Year C, and I'm going to do something a little bit different today. The gospel reading from the Common Lectionary for Good Friday is actually John chapters 18 and 19. It's quite lengthy, and rather than try to read all of that, show it all on screen and kind of parse out exactly the words and things that are talked about. What I'm going to do instead, especially since this is the first time we've hit Good Friday in the 3-year lectionary cycle, is just talk about the broad strokes as John presents it, and then talk about some of the themes that I and others see out of the Good Friday story, non-dual nuggets again, the things that reflect sort of some core stuff. And Good Friday has some core stuff here. And then go in and just talk about one way that one presentation of that John does as part of the story. So will read and show on screen a little bit of that. But Good Friday itself, wow, I mean, as part of again, we can kind of think of this as in three different things I think that the Gospels present. One is Jesus is a teacher, right? Just the same way as an enlightenment teacher, somebody who's instructing others. Another is the Jesus story itself is a mythological telling of kind of the enlightenment journey, the journey of non-recognition. And then three, like living out that recognition in the world, like an example of what it looks like, right? For somebody in that time and place, in that cultural and mythological context, cultural and religious context is what I mean, to have that non-dual recognition, to really embody it in a full realization and then manifest in the world. And that last part is kind of, I think, one of the things we get unique. And so in the Good Friday story, we get a real heavy dose of a mythological telling of the spiritual journey, and then a little bit of that last one, right? What does the manifestation look like here? And in John's telling, John in particular, others have observed this. John presents Jesus most as a spiritual being, right? As someone who has that non-dual recognition, that realization, and almost sometimes puts that above his humanness. So almost like the non and I keep saying non-dual, but that no self-recognition kind of privileged above all else in a way, and what that looks like just kind of walking through the world untouched by the world. And that untouchedness is an aspect, right, of the non-dual realization. It's just not the only aspect. So John is a hugely valuable addition to the story because especially the other three gospels really get Jesus as mixing it up in the world. So in any event, in John's telling the Good Friday story, chapters 18 and 19, John chapters 18 and 19, chapter 18 starts with the betrayal, right? And in some of the other gospels, and we'll get to those hopefully in a year or two, as long as we keep following the lectionary. But John presents again like sort of this a little bit antiseptic view of it. Jesus is there, and Judas appears to betray him, and Jesus says, "I am he," and everybody bows. I mean, that's a very spiritual telling of what's happening. But he's betrayed. He's taken into custody, and then we have the back and forth with Pilate, um, who seems at least reluctant to crucify him. We have the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, turning him over to first going to their own chief priests and kind of testing him out, determining he's a threat or a blasphemer, and turning him over to Pilate. Pilate being reluctant to do anything about it, continually coming back to the priest, to the crowd, back to Jesus. Meanwhile, Peter is betraying Jesus 3 times. Um, and then we get the actual crucifixion story, that the way that John presents it. And in the crucifixion in John, again, we don't get that really visceral, we don't get Jesus crying out. We get this kind of a bit anodyne and a bit antiseptic, where he just does the "it is finished," and then we do get the story of of his side being pierced and his burial and lots of explicit references to prophecies to come before. So that's the general outline of the Good Friday story as John presents it in chapters 18 and 19. And then a couple things I want to talk about. Now, first, I did allude to this a couple videos ago, but Adyashanti in particular has a specific take on Good Friday and the crucifixion as the mythological telling of the death of self. And I can't speak to that so much myself. I don't think I have that full embodied to be able to say, oh, I recognize this in my own story. But I at least want to throw that out there, right? That Adya kind of talks about the baptism as the awakening experience, the transfiguration is kind of the death of ego or the self, and whatever you want to call it, the divine reality, the evolutionary impulse, so however you want to define it, become sort of united, and so the ego, the small self, kind of dies away. But then this being the death of self at all, and not meaning the inability to be self-referential, but just that everything now is just the movement of, again, whatever you want to call it, divine or being or spirit or the universe as it is manifested, embodied right here. That's all that's happening after that. There's no more self to defend at all or to contract around. Um, and so, in John's telling, then again, like Jesus kind of takes care of a few last things along the way here. He does some teaching, and what I'm gonna talk about specifically is the back and forth with Pilate. Um, but he does some teaching. He's a teacher to the end in that way, right? Um, he does the thing where the beloved disciple, who we often call John, that we think of as the writer of John, he sees his mother Mary, and while hanging on the cross again, in this just sort of, oh, I'm just here way, says, Mother, this is your son, this is your mother, that they'll care for each other going forward. And then after a couple prophecy things, just bows his head, says, it is finished, and let's go. Again, that's very much not in the visceral, the yelling out that we get in some of the other gospels, but just a letting go. What I want to talk about more in the mythological aspect of the Good Friday story is just the pattern, and this is, very much from Richard Rohr, right? The pattern of death and resurrection. What we get in Easter is the resurrection story, right? And particularly the way that in a lot of churches today, people show up on Sundays, right? So you come today and Jesus is entering Jerusalem, hooray! We all cheer. You wave the palms, and then the next time people go to church is Easter. Hooray, Jesus is risen. We just go from hooray to hooray, which I think is pretty much meaningless in any way, not even just in a deep way. But as far as the mythological telling of the spiritual journey, um, death and rebirth, death and what comes after is like core to the spiritual journey, both individually, right? Because every death along the way, whether, if you think about death of ego, death of self, but even the shorter little pieces along the way, death of worldview, death of, sense of self, each of those is felt like a death and a stronger one as we go on, right? And so there's that fear that collapses around it. I mean, I think I've said this before, but I had an experience on retreat once where just sitting meditating, eyes closed, I felt, all I can identify is I could feel my sense of self just start to drop. I can feel it right now just talking about that. And what happened viscerally was inside my head, I just started to yell, not out loud, but internally, I, just contract around it, not let this go. And that's very much, I think, that urge to not die, right? That self-preservation urge. And so here we have in Good Friday just an example, right? And it's two things I want to talk about there. One is just the example of Jesus as walking that path, right? In John's telling, he just gives it up, right? It is finished. Um, and that's a a model of when you've truly embodied that recognition and that realization. It's just a letting go. And that's all it is, a letting go. Even on the outside, it can look like something awful, but it's just a letting go. But secondly, and I think this particularly comes through in the Christian telling of this, right? Is that if Jesus really is in the Christian story, an embodiment of the divine. And, again, we can use the divine to stand in for anything that works for you, right? But the universe, reality, true self, the recognition of what is. But if Jesus is embodying that fully, right, and yet goes through this awful thing, this betrayal, torture, crucifixion, death, um, then what does that mean for us, right? One, I think what it means is the spiritual journey promises nothing. James Finley has this phrase, he says, God protects us from nothing, but unexplainably sustains us in all things. And I've been in rooms where he says that, and I see people just, ooh, and you get these murmurs and these head nods. It sounds so good. And the more I think about that, the more it hits me how disappointing that is. Because what do I really want? I want to be protected from these things, right? I got into the spiritual practice, I think, like a lot of people, right? Some sense of like, I mean, it can be all sorts of things. For me, it was like, I want to be protected from suffering. And there's a link here to the Buddhist Eightfold, the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth being existence is suffering. Yes, I know that there's some different translations of that, but just go with me for now. Existence is suffering. And then the next three, though, are the way out, right? And that's the really important part because the first is just, yeah, saying, okay, yeah, it's bad, but look how we can get away from it. And I think what Good Friday and the First Noble Truth show us is the real truth of that, right? Existence is suffering, the spiritual recognition, the full realization of your true self manifested in the world will not protect you from that, from the awfulness of the world, of what it is to be alive. The first noble truth is a noble truth. It's not something to escape from. And what would that, and in the Christian telling, again, is that God, the divine, is in the worst of what happens, doesn't run away from it, doesn't escape from it, doesn't rescue or protect from it. And what does that mean? Oh man, I mean, you can take it yourself. Right? It just opens up the doors of compassion, first of all, because this is where we all are. This is what's true for all of us. It tells us nothing's wrong when we're going through that. That it's not that there's something wrong with the world that needs to be fixed, because this is just the way things are. This is what we go through. Um, but also it's the doorway then, right? Uh, with loss and with death and with suffering, there's something on the other side. And it's not another side that negates it, makes it go away, right? But the doorway. So Good Friday, again, I think it's crucial. If we had to skip, I mean, the way, again, that a lot of people do church these days is you skip Good Friday and go straight to Easter. I think that doesn't work at all. Resurrection without Good Friday doesn't mean anything. If we had to skip one, we should skip Easter because, what's in the grist of Good Friday is huge. And then there's a few other things, right? Like Peter not being fully on the not being fully there yet, right? Peter, in all the gospel stories we get, like he gets like some glimpses, but he's just never quite got it. He's not fully recognized himself. He's not fully realized himself. He's still holding on to his sense of self and how, that how Jesus fits in with like making the world and organizing his life. And so here we go, right? Peter denying Jesus three times is just, when the rubber hits the road, right? When Jesus hits the road, the rubber hits the road for Jesus here, right? When it's, are you going to deny who you are? Are you going to put yourself on the cross? He's like, yeah, this is who I am. This is what it is. When Peter gets confronted with it in the three denials, right? Every time it's no, no, no. And that's where we all are too, right? Along the way. The world will test your recognition. The world will test your experience and it'll just tell you where you're at. And that we don't have to criticize, you don't have to get down on yourself. It just tells you where you're at. And this story tells us Jesus at the end, it is finished, right? Jesus, Pilate saying, "Who are you?" You know, he says, "You say who I am." Um, doesn't deny, doesn't try to get a way out, doesn't try to, faced with the choice of you can hold on to self and escape, perhaps at least temporarily, the suffering, this awfulness, or you can live fully into that non-dual recognition. And for Jesus, there is no choice because if you have that recognition, that's just where you're at. It's actually not a choice so much, right? As you find out where you're at. And for Peter, he's just not there. And no criticism really. And then the last thing I want to talk about is Jesus's interactions with Judas. And I will read it. I mean, not Judas, but Pilate. I'll read a few of those because here I think we see Jesus two things, right? One, Jesus being, like I just said, giving like these tests coming up as the world, as reality, as the universe always does, and you know, just are you really? Is this really your recognition? Is this really your realization? Are you really living from as no self, right? Or from true nature? And Jesus always is yes. But also Jesus' teacher all the way through the end, right? He's interacting with Pilate just as he's done with the disciples all along. And now he's saying, I'm going to keep teaching actually all the way through the end because Pilate keeps trying to get an answer that Pilate can hold on to. And Jesus just refuses and keeps along the way. So, first in chapter 18, starting on verse 33, right? Pilate comes in, asks, Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus doesn't give the straight answer, yes or no, right? Doesn't give Pilate an answer that he can hold on to, and also doesn't try to escape from the question. Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Pilate replied, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? And then Jesus, my kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. So you are a king, Pilate asked. And again, there's just no way out. You say that I'm a king. For this I was born. For this I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. So Jesus just saying, I'm here to embody this. I'm here to be the teacher, right? And Pilate said, well, what is truth? And then in chapter 19, he comes back. Chief priests say, crucify him, take him yourselves, right? And they say, we have a law. According to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. Okay, so now Pilate knows he's caught between a rock and a hard place. Goes back again, asks Jesus, where are you from? And Jesus gives no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know I have the power to release you and power to crucify you? Right. So now Pilate's here as I have this. I am the agent of reality here, right? And in normal reality of you as a separate self, what's what are you going to do? And Jesus is not engaging with that reality. You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Jesus continually back and I mean, again, always along that line of who he truly is, which is not his self, right? It's unity with something greater, but also answering Pilate in a way that like Jesus's teacher, right? From because Pilate's reaction to this, he gets it a little bit. He tries to release him, right? And Pilate's then caught again. Anyone who claims to be a king sets himself against Caesar. So, the crowd here is embodying this like, hey, we're just in the world here, right? You need to do this because if you're part of the world, you have to be. And that's Pilate being caught there. So he hears these things. He says to the Jews, here's your king, tries to turn him over. Shall I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar. There you go again. But what does Pilate do in the end? He has an inscription put up, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And they said, don't write King of the Jews, but this man said, I am King of the Jews. And Pilate says, what I have written, I have written. So again, Jesus to the end being the teacher of someone who, Pilate presented here, at least in John's gospel, as like caught between these two worlds, getting that there's something else going on here, trying to navigate it himself, right? And in the end, what he does is Pilate's not there himself. Okay. But he sees that there's something else going on. So he writes the King of the Jews. Pretty amazing story. Just so rich again. And we could divide this into we could talk about this for days and days, little pieces over and over. We just touched on a bit. But it'll come back around next year and the year after, different versions from the other gospels. But again, um, really, really just an amazing telling of what is for all of us, even at the same time, a story, a myth that sticks for centuries now.